Hey boys and girls, I'm going to read you chapter 6 and part of chapter 7 today, and then you're going to finish chapter 7. So, Pod and Homily told Arrietty a lot about other borrowers yesterday, but they didn't tell her what they'd really gotten her up for. So, Homily kind of went on and on and on about lots of things, but didn't tell Arrietty specifically why she needed to know all of that. And Pod is going to do that right now. Chapter 6. Your mother and I got you up, said Pod, to tell you about upstairs. Arrietty, holding the great cup in both hands, looked at him over the edge. Pod coughed. You said a while back that the sky was dark brown with cracks in it. Well, it isn't. He looked at her almost accusingly. It's blue. I know, said Arrietty. You know? Exclaimed Pod. Yes, of course I know. I've got the grating. Can you see the sky through the grating? Go on, interrupted Homily. Tell her about the gates. Well, said Pod ponderously, if you go outside this room, what do you see? A dark passage, said Arrietty. And what else? Other rooms. And if you go farther, more passages. And if you go walking on and all the passages under the floor, however they twist and turn, what do you find? Gates, said Arrietty. Strong gates, said Pod. Gates you can't open. What are they there for? Against the mice? Asked Arrietty. Yes, agreed Pod uncertainly, as though he gave her half a mark. But mice never hurt no one. What else? Rats? Suggested Arrietty. We don't have rats, said Pod. What about cats? Cats? Echoed Arrietty, surprised. Or to keep you in, suggested Pod. To keep me in? Repeated Arrietty, dismayed. Upstairs is a dangerous place, said Pod. And you, Arrietty? You're all I got, see? It isn't like Hendry. He still has 2 of his own and 2 of hers. Once, said Pod, Hendry had 3 of his own. Your father's thinking of Eglatina, said Homily. Yes, said Pod, Eglatina. They never told her about upstairs, and they hadn't got no grating. They told her the sky was nailed up like, with cracks in it. A foolish way to bring up a child, murmured Homily. She sniffed slightly and touched Arrietty's hair. But Eglatina was no fool, said Pod. She didn't believe them, so one day, he went on, she went upstairs to see for herself. How did she get out? Asked Arrietty, interested. Well, we didn't have so many gates then, just the one under the clock. Hendry must have left it unlocked or something. Anyway, Eglatina got out. In a blue dress, said Homily, and a pair of button boots your father made her. Yellow kid with jet beads for buttons. Lovely they were. Well, said Pod, any other time it might have been all right. She'd have gone out, had a look around, had a bit of fright maybe, and come back, none the worse and none the wiser. But things had been happening, said Homily. Yes, said Pod. She didn't know, as they never told her, that her father had been seen and that upstairs they had got in the cat, and they waited a week, said Homily, and they waited a month, and they hoped for a year, but no one ever saw Eglatina no more. And that, said Pod after a pause and eyeing Arrietty, is what happened to Eglatina. There was silence except for Pod's breathing and the faint bubble of soup. It just broke up, your Uncle Hendry, said Homily at last. He never went upstairs again. In case, he said, he found the button boots. Their only future was to emigrate. Arrietty was silent for a moment. Then she raised her head. Why did you tell me, she asked. Now, tonight. Homily got up. She moved restlessly toward the stove. We don't never talk of it, she said. At least not much, but tonight we felt... She turned suddenly. Well, we'll just say it straight out. Your father's been seen, Arrietty. Oh, said Arrietty. Who by? Well, by something you've never heard of. But that's not the point. The point is, you think they'll get a cat? They may, said Homily. Arrietty set down the soup for a moment. She stared into the cup as it stood beside her almost knee-high on the floor. There was a dreamy secret, something about her lowered face couldn't we emigrate? She ventured at last softly. Homily gasped and clasped her hands and swung away toward the wall. You don't know what you're talking about, she cried, addressing a frying pan which hung there. Worms and weasels and cold and damp and... But supposing, said Arrietty, that I went out like Eglatina did and the cat ate me. Then you and Papa would emigrate, wouldn't you? She asked and her voice faltered. Wouldn't you? Homily swung round again, this time toward Arrietty. Her face looked very angry. I shall smack you, Arrietty Clack, if you don't behave yourself this minute. Arrietty's eyes filled with tears. I was only thinking, she said, that I'd like to be there, to emigrate too. Uneaten, she added softly, and the tears fell. Now, said Pod, this is enough. You get off to bed, Arrietty, uneaten and unbeaten both, and we'll talk about it in the morning. It's not that I'm afraid, cried Arrietty angrily. I like cats. I bet the cat didn't eat Eglatina. I bet she just ran away because she hated being cooped up, day after day, week after week, year after year, like I do, she added on a sob. Cooped up, repeated Homily, astounded. Arrietty put her face into her hands. Gates, she gasped. Gates, gates, gates. Pod and Homily stared at each other across Arrietty's bowed shoulders. You didn't ought to have brought it up, he said unhappily. Not so late at night. Arrietty raised her tear-streaked face. Late or early, what's the difference? She cried. Oh, I know Papa is a wonderful borrower. I know we've managed to stay when all the others have gone. But what has it done for us in the end? I don't think it's so clever to live on alone forever and ever in a great big half-empty house under the floor with no one to talk to, no one to play with, nothing to see but dust and passages, no light but candlelight and firelight and what comes through the cracks. Eglatina had brothers, and Eglatina had half-brothers. Eglatina had a tame mouse. Eglatina had yellow boots with jet buttons, and Eglatina did get out just once. Shush, said Pod gently, not so loud. Above their heads, the floor creaked and heavy footfalls heaved deliberately to and fro. They heard Mrs. Driver's grumbling voice and the clatter of the fire irons. Drat this stove, they heard her say. Wind's in the east again. Then they heard her raise her voice and call, Cramp furl! Pod sat staring glumly at the floor. Arrietty shivered a little and hugged herself more tightly in the knitted quilt, and Homily drew a long, slow breath. Suddenly, she raised her head. The child is right, she announced firmly. Arrietty's eyes grew big. Oh, no, she began. It shocked her to be right. Parents were right, not children. Children could say anything. Arrietty knew and enjoyed saying it, knowing always they were safe and wrong. You see, Pod, went on Homily, it was different for you and me. There were other families, other children. The sinks and the scullery, remember? And those people who lived behind the knife machine. I forgot their names now. And the broom cupboard boys. And there was that underground passage from the stables. You know, that the rain pipes used. We had more, as you might say. Freedom. Ah, yes, said Pod. In a way. But where does freedom take you? He looked up uncertainly. Where are they all now? Some of them may have bettered themselves, I should wonder, said Homily sharply. Times have changed in this whole house. Pickings aren't what they were. There were just those that went, you remember, when they dug a trench for the gas pipe, over the fields and through the wood and all. All kind of a tunnel it gave them, all the way to Leighton Buzzard. And what did they find there, said Pod unkindly. A mountain of coke. Homily turned away. Arrietty, she said in the same firm voice, supposing one day we'd pick a special day when there was no one about, and providing they don't get a cat, which I have many reasons for thinking they won't, supposing one day your father took you out borrowing, you'd be a good girl, wouldn't you? You'd do just what he said, quietly and quickly, and no arguing. Arrietty turned quite pink. She clasped her hands together. Oh, she began in an ecstatic voice, but Pod cut it in quickly. Now, Homily, we gotta think. You can't just say these things like that without thinking about it proper. I've been seen, remember? This is no kind of time for taking a child upstairs. There won't be no cat, said Homily. There wasn't no screeching. It's not like the time with Rosa Pickhatchet. All the same, said Pod uncertainly, the risk's there. I never heard of no girl going borrowing before. The way I look at it, said Homily, and it's only now it's come to me, if you had a son, you'd take him borrowing now, wouldn't you? Well, you haven't got no son, only Arrietty. Suppose anything happened to you or me. Where would Arrietty be if she hadn't learned to borrow? Pod stared down at his knees. Yes, he said after a moment, I see what you mean. And it'll give her a bit of interest, like, and stop her hankering. Hankering for what? For blue sky and grass and such like? Arrietty caught her breath, and Homily turned on her swiftly. It's no good, Arrietty. I'm not going to emigrate. Not for you nor anyone else. Ah, said Pod, and began to laugh. So that's it. Shush, said Homily, annoyed, and glanced quickly at the ceiling. Not so loud. Now kiss your father, Arrietty, she went on briskly, and pop off back to bed. As Arrietty snuggled down under the bedclothes, she felt, creeping up from her toes, a glow of happiness, like a glow of warmth. She heard their voices rising and falling in the next room. Homilies went on, measured and confident. There was, Arrietty felt, a kind of conviction behind it. It was the winning voice. Once she heard Pod get up and the scrape of a chair. I don't like it, she heard him say, and she heard Homily whisper, hush, and there were tremendous footfalls in the floor above and the sudden clash of pans. Arrietty, half dozing, gazed up at her painted ceiling. The lovely gauzy ladies blew their trumpets silently, triumphantly, on soundless notes of glee. There's her bedroom. I don't know. I think you can see it. Oops, I was trying to turn the page. See how it's a cigar box, so the lid is there? Chapter 7. For the next 3 weeks, Arrietty was especially good. She helped her mother tidy the storerooms. She swept and watered the passages and trod them down. She sorted and graded the beads, which they used as buttons, into the screw tops of aspirin bottles. She cut old kid gloves into squares for Pod's shoemaking. She filed fishbone needles to a bee-sting sharpness. She hung up the washing to dry by the grating so that it blew in the soft air. And at last the day came, that dreadful, wonderful, never-to-be-forgotten day when Homily, scrubbing the kitchen table, straightened her back and called, Pod! He came in from his workroom, last in hand. Look at this brush, cried Homily. It was a fiber brush with plaited fiber back. Aye, said Pod, worn down. Gets me knuckles now, said Homily, every time I scrub. Pod looked worried. Since he had been seen, they had stuck to kitchen borrowing, the bare essentials of fuel and food. There was an old mouse hole under the kitchen stove upstairs, which at night when the fire was out or very low, Pod could use as a chute to save carrying. Since the window curtain incident, they had pushed a matchbox chest of drawers below the mouse hole and had stood a wooden stool on the chest of drawers, and Pod, with much help and shoving from Homily, had learned to squeeze up that chute instead of down. In this way, he need not venture into the great hall and passages. He could just nip out from under the vast black stove in the kitchen for a clove or a carrot or a tasty piece of ham. But it was not a satisfactory arrangement. Even when the fire was out, often there was hot ash and cinders under the stove, and once he emerged, a great brush came at him, wielded by Mrs. Driver, and he slithered back on top of Homily, singed, shaken, and coughing dust. Another time, for some reason, the fire had been in full blaze, and Pod had arrived suddenly beneath a glowing inferno, dropping white-hot coals. But usually at night the fire was out, and Pod could pick his way through the cinders into the kitchen proper. Mrs. Driver's out, Homily went on. It's her day off, and she, they always spoke of Aunt Sophie as she, is safe enough in bed. It's not them that worries me, said Pod. Why? Exclaimed Homily sharply. The boy's not still there. I don't know, said Pod. There's always a risk, he added. And there always will be, retorted Homily. Like when you was in the coal cellar and the coal cart came. But the other two, said Pod, Mrs. Driver and her. I always know what they are like, where they are like. As for that, exclaimed Homily, a boy's even better. You can hear a boy a mile off. Well, she went on after a moment, please yourself, but it's not like you to talk of risks. Pod sighed. All right, he said, and turned away to fetch his borrowing bag. Take the child, called Homily after him. Pod turned. Now, Homily, he began in an alarmed voice. Why not? Asked Homily sharply. It's just the day. You aren't going no farther than the front door. If you're nervous, you can leave her by the clock, ready to nip underneath and down the hole. Let her just see at any rate. Arrietty! As Arrietty came running in, Pod tried again. Now listen, Homily, he protested. Homily ignored him. Arrietty, she said brightly, would you like to go along with your father and borrow some brush fiber from the doormat in the hall? Arrietty gave a little skip. Oh, she cried, could I? Well, take your apron off, said Homily, and change your boots. You want light shoes for borrowing. Better wear the red, kid. And then as Arrietty spun away, Homily turned to Pod. She'll be all right, she said. You'll see. As she followed her father down the passage, Arrietty's heart began to beat faster. Now the moment had come, at last. She found it almost too much to bear. She felt light and trembly and hollow with excitement. They had 3 borrowing bags between the 2 of them. In case, Pod had explained, we pick up something. A bad borrower loses many a chance for lack of an extra bag. And Pod laid these down to open the first gate, which was latched by a safety pin. It was a big pin, too strongly sprung for little hands to open, and Arrietty watched her father swing his whole weight on the bar and his feet kick loose off the ground, hanging from his hands. He shifted his weight along the pin toward the curved sheath, and as he moved, the pin sprang open, and he in the same instant jumped free. You couldn't do that, he remarked, dusting his hands. Too late. Nor could your mother. Come along now, quietly. There are other gates, all of which Pod left open. Never shut a gate on the way out, he explained in a whisper. You might need to get back quick. And after a while, Arrietty saw a faint light at the end of the passage. She pulled her father's sleeve. Is that it? She whispered. Pod stood still. Quietly now, he warned her. Yes, that's it. So this is like, these are the passages they're going through. The hole under the clock. As he said these words, Arrietty felt breathless, but outwardly she made no sign. There are 3 steps up to it, Pod went on. Steep like, so mind how you go. When you're under the clock, you just stay there. Don't let your mind wander and keep your eyes on me. If all's clear, I'll give you the sign. The steps were high and a little uneven, but Arrietty took them more lightly than Pod. As she scrambled past the jagged edges of the hole, she had a sudden, big, blinding glimpse of molten gold. It was spring sunshine on the pale stones of the hall floor. Standing upright, she could no longer see this. She could only see the cave-like shadows in the great case above her and the dim outline of the hanging weights. The hollow darkness around her vibrated with sound. It was a safe sound, solid and regular and far above her head. She saw the movement of the pendulum. So they're inside the clock. The pendulum is the part that tick-tocks back and forth. It gleamed a little in the half-light, remote and cautious in its rhythmic swing. Arrietty felt warm tears behind her eyelids and a sudden swelling pride. So this, at last, was the clock. Their clock, after which her family was named. For 200 years it had stood there, deep-voiced and patient, guarding their threshold and measuring their time. But Pods, she saw, stood crouched beneath the carved archway against the light. Keep your eyes on me, he had said, so Arrietty crouched too. She saw the gleaming golden stone floor of the hall stretching away into the distance. She saw the edges of rugs, like richly colored islands in a molten sea, and she saw, in the glory of the sunlight, like a dreamed-of gateway to fairyland, the open front door. Beyond, she saw grass, and against the clear, bright sky, a waving frond of green. Pod's eyes slewed around. Wait, he breathed, and watch. And then in a flash, he was gone. Ariadne saw him scurry across the sunlit floor. Swiftly he ran as a mouse runs or a blown dried leaf, and suddenly she saw him as small. But, she told herself, he isn't small. He's half a head taller than Mother. She watched him run round a chestnut-colored island of doormat into the shadows behind the door. There, it seemed, he became invisible. Ariadne watched and waited. All was still except for a sudden whir within the clock. A grinding whir it was, up high in the hollow darkness above her head. Then the sliding grate of slipped metal before the clock sang out its chime. 3 notes were struck, deliberate and mellow. Take it or leave it, they seemed to say, but that's the time. A sudden movement near the shadowed lintel of the front door, and there was Pod again, bag in hand beside the mat. It rose knee-deep before him like a field of chestnut corn. So picture that, it's a doormat that we wipe our feet on before we go inside. And when Pod stands on it, the fluff of the doormat comes up to his knees. Ariadne saw him glance toward the clock, and then she saw him raise his hand. Oh, the warmth of the stone flags as she ran across them, the gladdening sunlight on her face and hands, the awful space around her. Pod caught her and held her at last and patted her shoulder. There, there, he said. Get your breath, good girl. Panting a little, Ariadne gazed up above her. She saw great chair legs rearing up into the sunlight. She saw the shadowed undersides of their seats spread above like canopies. She saw the nails and the strapping and odd tags of silk and string. She saw the terraced cliffs of the stairs mounting up in the distance. Up and up. She saw carved table legs in a cavern under the chest. And all the time, in the stillness, the clock spoke, measuring out the seconds, spreading its layers of calm. So you're going to finish this chapter by yourselves. It's in the Google form that is right under this video on, what's tomorrow? Friday already. So you're going to look at Friday. You'll see this video first, and then you're going to see the Google form underneath. And we're not going to do journal tomorrow. Well, today. I'm reading this on Thursday afternoon. So, I will see you later. Have fun reading.